I once believed that raising my children with unconditional love would ensure their gratitude in the years to come. How naive I was. The day I overheard my eldest son, Jacob, calling me financial dead weight while talking to his wife on the phone, was the day that 40 years of maternal sacrifice came crashing down. What he failed to realize was that this seemingly frail 68-year-old widow wasn't going to silently accept his betrayal. No, I had a different vision for the $42 million family trust that my late husband, Robert, had entrusted to my care. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. Martha Sullivan sat alone in her cozy kitchen, the faint scent of freshly baked pies still lingering in the air. Her hands rested on the table, gripping the edge as if trying to steady herself from the weight of a decision she never thought she would have to make. The house she had built with Robert, her late husband, stood proud in the Oak Ridge Historic District, a symbol of their joint efforts to create a life filled with family, memories, and love. But now, that very house, that very legacy, felt more like a prison. For over 40 years, Martha had defined herself as a mother, raising 8 children, supporting Robert's growing construction business, and always putting her family's needs ahead of her own. But after Robert's sudden death 15 years ago, Martha had to step into both the roles of mother and father for her youngest children. She never complained, never considered asking for help. Family was everything. But in recent months, things had started to shift. It began at Thanksgiving, when her son Jacob and his wife Rebecca began suggesting it was time for Martha to leave her home, citing concerns about her memory. It was a simple mistake, calling her youngest son Nathan by his older brother Thomas's name, but for Jacob and Rebecca, it was the spark they needed to start planning for her departure. Jacob proposed moving her into assisted living, selling the family home, and liquidating everything, including the lakeside cabin at Silver Lake, a place that had meant so much to Martha and her children. All the while, they were trying to assure her it was for her benefit, that they were simply looking out for her. Martha, however, saw through their facade. She had spent years managing Robert's business, keeping track of accounts, balancing books, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. She was no stranger to managing finances, and certainly not to the family trust. But now she realized, her family was looking at her differently, as if she was incapable of making decisions for herself. Jacob, her own son, had already started talking about taking over as trustee. They had no idea, however, that Martha had been preparing for this moment. She sat alone in Robert's study, pulling out the family trust documents she kept in the safe. They had been Robert's pride and joy, a careful plan designed to ensure the family's financial security. With the trust, Martha had significant power. She controlled the family home, the business interests Robert had built, the life insurance payout, and the lakeside cabin that held so many cherished memories. As trustee, she could make decisions, change beneficiaries, even remove them if necessary. But Martha had always used that power with love, with the knowledge that it would eventually be shared amongst her children after her passing. It was a balance, a careful plan. Yet now, that plan was under threat. The next evening, Jacob and Rebecca invited Martha to dinner at the Copper Kettle, Oak Ridge's most upscale restaurant. Martha knew immediately why they were asking. They only invited her when they wanted something. As they sat down to a sumptuous meal, Jacob casually brought up the idea of moving her to Sunnyside Meadows, an assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. Without discussing it with her, they had already put down a deposit for a 1-bedroom unit. They were thinking of selling the house, the cabin, and everything else to cover her care, Jacob suggested. When Martha asked about the family cabin at Silver Lake, Jacob was quick to dismiss it. It needed repairs, he said, and should be sold as well. What was left for Martha, though, was the unsettling realization that Jacob was now managing Robert's business interests and had designs on more than just her house. He wanted control over everything. The trust documents, the family assets, the decisions that had always been hers to make. As Martha listened, her heart sank. She had always known that the family trust would bring about disagreements, but this was something different. The next day, Martha visited Patricia Morgan, the family attorney. Patricia had known Martha for years, respected her, and understood exactly what Martha had contributed to the family's wealth. When Martha explained her concerns, Patricia walked her through the options available to her as trustee. Though the family trust was a delicate thing, Martha had the power to modify it, to ensure that her wishes were respected and that no one could take advantage of her. Jacob had crossed a line. He and Rebecca had overestimated her. Martha spent the next few weeks preparing for what was to come. She consulted with neurologists, ensuring her cognitive abilities were intact despite the insinuations that she was suffering from memory loss. She updated all her financial accounts, made sure the trust was intact, and moved valuables to a safety deposit box. It was a silent battle, one that Jacob didn't know she was waging. She didn't want to confront him directly, not yet. But she was ready. Her instincts were right. The pressure was building. Jacob and Rebecca's pressure to sell the house and liquidate everything was only the surface of a much deeper, darker plan. It wasn't just about Martha's independence. It was about greed and control. For years, Jacob had been managing the family business, Sullivan Construction, but now it was clear that his interests were no longer just financial. There was a sense of entitlement in his voice when he spoke of the trust. He felt it was his birthright, his to control. And Martha's refusal to play along was an obstacle he wasn't ready to face. When Jacob made his move, it wasn't just about manipulating Martha. He was about to make a play for everything. The fraud within the company began to surface, with allegations of misuse of company funds, embezzlement, and financial mismanagement. Jacob, desperate to cover his tracks, had been using Sullivan Construction's resources for personal projects, including lavish home renovations. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Jacob wasn't just trying to control his mother's finances. He was on the brink of losing everything. Martha had no idea that the depth of Jacob's deception would reach this point, but she was ready to face whatever came next. She could no longer trust her son the way she once did, and though it broke her heart, she knew that something needed to change. Martha's days grew quieter after that dinner at the Copper Kettle, the one that had planted the first seeds of doubt in her mind. Jacob and Rebecca's words echoed in her head, and she could no longer pretend everything was fine. She knew that a confrontation was coming, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it head-on, not yet. Jacob's manipulative tactics were becoming clearer with every passing day, and what once felt like family concern now felt like a well-calculated scheme to strip her of control. She wasn't going to let that happen. After the dinner, Martha retreated to her sanctuary, Robert's study. It was there, surrounded by photographs, letters, and the memories of their life together, that she found her resolve. Robert had always believed in the importance of family, but he also believed in fairness, in ensuring that each person had what they needed. But the trust he had left her, the one he had meticulously created, was now at the center of a battle she never imagined having to fight. Over the next few weeks, Martha worked diligently, consulting with her trusted attorney, Patricia Morgan, and gathering the documents she would need to make changes to the trust. As trustee, she had the authority to modify the distributions, and with the threat from Jacob becoming more pronounced, she wasn't willing to wait until things became worse. She began the slow process of protecting what was hers. The family trust was a delicate balance, carefully crafted by Robert. It was meant to ensure the continued success of Sullivan Construction while also benefiting his children, his legacy. But what Jacob didn't seem to understand was that his entitlement to the company, the trust, and everything that came with it, didn't come from his birthright alone. It came from his work, from his ability to manage the company Robert had built from the ground up. And for Martha, who had been by Robert's side through it all, the trust was not just a document. It was a legacy, one that should be preserved, not dismantled. She had always taken pride in how she managed everything, balancing the family's needs, the household, and Robert's business. But as Jacob's behavior grew more erratic and self-serving, Martha began to see the manipulation for what it was. She didn't trust him with anything anymore. Not her home, not the trust, and certainly not the business. When Martha met with Patricia again, she went over the changes she planned to make to the trust. She wasn't going to let Jacob take what wasn't his, and she wasn't going to allow him to manipulate her into a decision that only benefited him. The changes, while legal, would ensure that her wishes were respected, not just for her benefit, but for the benefit of all her children. Patricia's concern about the changes was valid. Family trusts had a history of creating conflict, of fracturing relationships that were already fragile. But Martha knew that the conflict already existed. Jacob had made it clear that he wasn't interested in what was fair or what Robert would have wanted. He only cared about the money, the assets, and the power that came with it. Martha had to be careful. She wasn't interested in tearing the family apart, but she was no longer willing to sacrifice her dignity or her control over the legacy she had helped build. She had to act, even if it meant alienating some of her children. The following Sunday, when Jacob invited her for another dinner, Martha knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying once again to manipulate her, to convince her that he was looking out for her. But this time she was prepared. She went into the dinner with one goal: to protect herself and her children, to ensure that no one could take what wasn't theirs. Jacob wasted no time. After the appetizers were cleared, he casually brought up the topic of the family home. "Mom, it must be so much work to maintain this big house," he said, his voice filled with feigned concern. Martha could feel the anger building in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I manage fine," she replied. "The property taxes are taken care of. And I'm not worried about the maintenance." Rebecca chimed in, her voice dripping with sweetness. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," she said, leaning forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's why we thought it would be better if you moved into Sunnyside Meadows. It's a lovely place. And we've already put down the deposit," Jacob added, his voice casual but with an underlying tone that told Martha it wasn't a suggestion, it was an ultimatum. Martha kept her composure. "What about the lakeside cabin?" she asked, her voice steady. Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. "It's not practical. It needs so much work, Mom. We think it would be better to sell it." Martha didn't flinch. The cabin at Silver Lake was more than just a piece of property. It was a part of her, a part of her children. She wasn't about to let Jacob make it just another item on his list of assets to be sold. "And what would happen to my home?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jacob's answer was quick, and his tone even more dismissive. "We'd sell it. The market's hot right now, and the proceeds could pay for your care for years to come." Martha felt her heart beat faster. She could hear the words, but she wasn't hearing concern for her. She was hearing a desire to strip her of everything that mattered, everything that she had built with Robert. She wasn't going to let it happen. The conversation continued, but Martha's mind was already racing. She had to take control, and she had to act quickly. She smiled through the rest of dinner, nodding and answering in ways that kept the peace. But deep down, she knew this wasn't about peace. This was about survival. That night, she revisited the family trust documents and began to make the changes that would ensure her wishes were respected. She wasn't going to let Jacob or Rebecca take everything she had worked for. The days following that dinner at the Copper Kettle felt like a slow but inevitable descent into something Martha wasn't sure she was prepared for. Jacob and Rebecca's plans to remove her from her own home, while Master's concern, had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had spent the better part of a week mulling over her options, all while keeping up the appearances of being an obedient, concerned mother and grandmother. But deep inside, Martha knew it was time to take a stand, not just for herself, but for the legacy of everything Robert had built. She had been patient, too patient. 4 years, she'd sacrificed her own identity for the sake of her children, managing the household, supporting Robert's business, and being the pillar her family leaned on. But now, she was being treated like an obstacle, someone who needed to be controlled, and she wasn't going to allow that to happen. It was time to reclaim her voice. It was late one afternoon when she made the call to Patricia Morgan, her family lawyer, setting a meeting for the following day to discuss her next steps. Robert had entrusted Martha with the family trust, and she would uphold it. She wasn't about to let Jacob or anyone else strip her of that responsibility. Patricia's office was a familiar, comforting space. Its deep leather chairs and the scent of old books brought a sense of reassurance. Martha had been there countless times over the years, both for business and personal matters. But today, the air between them was different. Charged, heavy with the weight of what was at stake. "What are you thinking, Martha?" Patricia asked as she sat down across from her, the trust documents spread before them on the table. "I'm thinking it's time I make a few changes," Martha replied, her voice steady. She pulled out the stack of papers she had been meticulously reviewing in her own home. Papers that would help her maintain control over her assets and, most importantly, ensure that her children, Jacob included, couldn't walk all over her. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Changes? You're certain about this?" Martha nodded, leaning forward. "I have to be. If Jacob thinks he can take over everything, he's wrong. Robert and I built this, and I'll be damned if I let him tear it apart for his own benefit." Patricia's fingers tapped the table as she considered Martha's words. "The changes you're talking about, these could cause some serious ripples, Martha. Family trusts can get messy." "You're sure?" "I'm not just doing this for me," Martha said, her voice unwavering. "I'm doing it for all of us, for the family, for the children who truly care, for the future of what Robert and I created together. But Jacob can't control it. Not now. Not ever." They spent hours discussing the specifics of the changes. Martha had clear intentions. The family cabin would be placed in a trust for the use of all her children, ensuring it couldn't be sold off by anyone. Her house would remain hers for as long as she wanted, and when it was time for it to be sold, the proceeds would go to create a scholarship in Robert's name, supporting single parents who wanted to pursue higher education. And perhaps most importantly, the remaining funds in the trust would be divided, not equally, but based on each child's needs and, more significantly, their actions in the past 5 years. How much they had been involved in her life, how much they had supported her, or, in Jacob's case, how much he had taken her for granted. Patricia was silent for a moment, considering the gravity of Martha's decisions. Then, with a slow nod, she spoke. "I think this will hold up. You have a right to protect yourself and ensure that your wishes are followed, but—" Martha leaned in. "But—" Patricia sighed. "The family will push back. Jacob especially. And if they don't have legal ground to stand on, they'll go for emotional manipulation. He'll play the 'I'm the oldest son, I have the most responsibility' card. They might accuse you of favoring certain children over others." "I know," Martha said, her voice hardening. "But I've spent my life being the responsible one. Now, it's time for them to see that the only one who has a right to control my decisions is me. I'm doing this, Patricia. For myself. And for Robert." Patricia gave a rueful smile. "Well, it sounds like you've made up your mind. Let's proceed then." Martha didn't waste any time. By the end of the week, the modifications were in place. She'd quietly moved some valuable items to a safety deposit box, updated her financial accounts, and ensured that Jacob no longer had access to them. She wasn't trying to hide assets. She was simply making sure her financial and emotional security would remain intact. But even as she took these steps, the dread lingered. It wasn't just the legal paperwork or the financial assets she was protecting. It was the very essence of her independence, the right to make decisions about her life without anyone else undermining her. It was a battle for dignity. The phone call came a week later, right as Martha was tending to her garden. It was Jacob, his voice tight with frustration, but still laced with a false air of concern. "Mom," he began, "I've been thinking. Maybe it would make sense for Rebecca and me to move in with you. We could help with the house, maintenance, company stuff, anything you need. You won't be alone." Martha's hands stilled on the pruning shears. "I see," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "And what about your house?" Jacob didn't miss a beat. "We'd rent it out. The extra money could help everyone. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Martha could feel the trap being laid, the same one he had tried to set before. She had to decide whether she would be manipulated again or whether she would stand firm. "I appreciate the offer, Jacob," she said, her voice calm, "but I'm perfectly capable of handling everything myself." There was a pause on the other end. "Well, if you change your mind." "I won't," she interrupted firmly. Goodbye, Jacob. As Martha hung up the phone, she felt a surge of relief. She had taken a step toward reclaiming control, but she knew that this battle was far from over. Jacob would continue to push, to manipulate, to try and break her resolve. But Martha had already made the decision. She wouldn't back down, not for him, not for anyone. Her resolve was only solidifying as the days passed, and she felt ready for whatever was coming next. Martha's resolve grew stronger with each passing day, but so did the tension within her family. After the dinner where she had firmly refused Jacob's latest attempt to control her, she knew that the storm was far from over. Jacob wasn't the type to back down easily. He had always been the most stubborn of her children, and now, with the weight of the family's assets and legacy on the line, he would be relentless. The following weeks were a blur of legal consultations, meetings with Patricia Morgan, and late-night phone calls. Jacob, sensing that his control over the family trust was slipping away, had begun to escalate. He tried to convince Martha to meet with him alone, to have one final conversation, but she refused. She knew that his words would be carefully chosen, that any promise of compromise would come with hidden strings. Then, there were the subtle manipulations, the emails, the texts, the little comments during family gatherings. He tried to turn her other children against her, painting her as incapable of making sound decisions. But Martha was no fool. She could see through his tactics, and she wasn't willing to let him manipulate her children into siding with him. It wasn't just the legal battles that weighed heavily on Martha's heart. It was the realization that the trust she had worked so hard to build with her family, the unity she had fought for through years of raising them alone after Robert's death, was crumbling. Even though some of her children, like Daniel and Olivia, had expressed concern and stood by her, the divide between them all was growing. Emma, her most emotionally intuitive daughter, had been visibly torn during the family dinner, and Martha feared she might lose her. But she couldn't allow herself to be dragged back into the web of manipulation Jacob had spun so expertly for years. The pressure of it all felt suffocating, and yet, Martha remained steadfast. She knew that she had to do what was right, no matter how painful the consequences might be. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Martha received a call from Patricia that would shift the course of everything. "Martha, I think you need to be prepared for something." Patricia's voice was sharp, urgent. "Jacob has filed a petition to have you declared incompetent. He's claiming that your recent actions regarding the trust modifications are proof that you're losing your mental clarity." Martha's blood ran cold. She had known Jacob would go to extreme lengths to regain control, but she hadn't anticipated this. "Are you sure?" Martha asked, trying to steady her breath. "How is he planning to prove that?" "He's gathering testimonies from a few family members," Patricia said. "Rebecca has already agreed to help him, and he's trying to convince a few others that your decision-making is erratic. He's even cited the mix-up with Nathan's name as evidence." Martha's mind raced. It was true, she had mixed up Nathan's name during a family dinner, but that was hardly grounds for declaring her mentally incompetent. The stress she had been under, the pressure of trying to maintain her independence while fending off her son's attempts to control her, had caused a few lapses in memory, but nothing that was outside the realm of normal aging. Still, the fact that Jacob had taken the step to involve the courts in his attempt to undermine her was a wake-up call. This was no longer just about a family dispute over money and assets. It was a full-blown battle for her identity, her dignity, and her legacy. "Patricia," Martha said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and determination, "I want to fight this. I'm not going to let him strip me of everything I've worked for, not like this." "I understand," Patricia replied. "We'll need to move quickly. But I want you to know, this is going to get ugly. Jacob is going to make this personal." Martha set her jaw. "Let him. I'll prove I'm more than capable of managing my own life. And I'll make sure the rest of the family knows what he's really up to." The legal proceedings began within days. Jacob's petition was filed, and the wheels of the court system turned faster than Martha had expected. The papers were served to her, and she was forced to face the reality of what Jacob was attempting. He wasn't just trying to manipulate her. He was willing to go as far as declaring her incompetent in front of a judge. The emotional toll of this hit her harder than she cared to admit. Her children, the ones she had raised with so much love and sacrifice, were being pitted against her, each one forced to choose a side. It wasn't just about assets anymore. Jacob had weaponized their family relationships, and Martha wasn't sure how many of her children would side with her. Olivia, her daughter, had always been the more pragmatic of her children, but even she had been swayed by Jacob's manipulation. Daniel, her second oldest, had always been sensitive to the feelings of others, but he, too, had shown signs of hesitance. The days stretched on, filled with tense meetings and strategy sessions with Patricia. But Martha's resolve never wavered. She had to do this. Not just for herself, but for Robert's legacy. The family trust, which had always been a symbol of their unity, was now a symbol of division. She couldn't let that stand. One evening, as she sat alone in Robert's study, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She had just finished going through the trust documents again, making sure everything was in order. Her mind was heavy, but she hadn't felt the need for company. Yet, when she opened the door, she found her son Nathan standing there, his military uniform still pristine despite the late hour. "Mom," Nathan said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "I'm here. I'm staying with you. I know things have gotten out of hand, and I just want you to know, I've got your back." Martha's heart swelled with relief. Of all her children, Nathan had always been the most self-sufficient, the one who had never needed her financially. His steady presence was a balm to her troubled mind. "Thank you, Nathan," Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to ask for help, but I don't know how much longer I can fight this alone." "You won't have to," Nathan said firmly. "We're all in this together. Whatever happens with Jacob, we're standing by you." In that moment, Martha realized that no matter how far Jacob had gone to try and tear her apart, there were still those who loved her, who believed in her. And that, more than any legal victory or financial gain, was what truly mattered. As the legal battle over her competency continued, Martha drew strength from the unwavering support of Nathan and the small circle of family members who stood by her. But she also knew the storm wasn't over yet. Jacob was still a force to be reckoned with, and he had made it clear he wouldn't back down. But Martha was ready. She had spent her life fighting for her family. Now, she would fight for herself. The coming days would bring more challenges, more courtroom battles, and more hard decisions. But Martha was no longer the woman she had been before. She was stronger, more determined, and finally ready to reclaim the life she had worked so hard to build. For the first time in years, Martha felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but she had the strength to see it through. As the legal battles over Martha's competency raged on, the family's underlying fracture seemed to deepen. Jacob's attempt to have his mother declared incompetent was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, his actions were unraveling the very fabric of Sullivan construction, as his greed for control over the family fortune had led him into a dangerous spiral. The trust that Robert had built with such care was now the battlefield of a desperate man, and Martha was determined not to let him win, not when so much was at stake. The days were long, filled with endless phone calls and meetings. Patricia Morgan, her attorney, continued to assure Martha that she had a strong case. Martha was sharp, intelligent, and more than capable of managing her own affairs. The neurologist's reports confirmed what Martha already knew, that the lapses in memory she'd experienced were simply a product of aging, nothing more. But despite all the evidence, Jacob continued to paint her as a vulnerable, mentally unfit widow, incapable of making decisions for herself. Through it all, Martha had an unwavering focus. What hurt the most wasn't the legal manipulation or the financial games Jacob was playing. It was the feeling of betrayal. The son she had raised, nursed back to health through childhood illnesses, supported through heartbreaks, guided through adulthood, was now her adversary, willing to destroy everything for his own gain. Martha's other children, though not as vocal as Jacob, had all begun to react differently. Daniel, who had always been the more sensitive of her children, had begun to take a step back, caught in the tension between loyalty to his siblings and his concern for his mother. Olivia, the family's doctor, had been manipulated by Jacob's arguments, but the neurologist's reports and her own first-hand experience of Martha's health had made her question her brother's intentions. As the weeks went by, Martha felt more isolated than ever, even as her circle of support, Nathan and her loyal children, grew stronger. Nathan, ever the protector, had remained her constant ally, staying by her side and helping her with everything from phone calls to securing documents. His military training had become invaluable during this period, helping them navigate legal strategy and ensuring her personal safety in case Jacob's actions escalated. Martha's daughters, Sophia and Emma, had shown up when she needed them most. Sophia, always the artistic and intuitive one, had spent hours with her mother, listening to her, encouraging her, and even offering practical help when Martha started to feel overwhelmed. Emma, the emotional heart of the family, had spent sleepless nights with her mother, not just listening, but rallying the other children who could still be convinced to see things clearly. It was during one of these late-night talks with Emma that Martha began to accept the truth. Jacob had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He wasn't just after money. He had been using her, his own mother, as a pawn in a much larger game, one that involved power, control, and greed. "I can't believe how far he's willing to go," Emma had said, tears in her eyes. "It's like he's not even the same person anymore." Martha had held her daughter's hands, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the man who had been her firstborn son was lost to her. "You're right," she had whispered. "He's changed. But I still love him. I don't want to lose him completely. I just can't let him destroy everything." It was this raw honesty that kept Martha grounded. She loved her children, all of them, but her love could no longer come at the cost of her dignity or her independence. She had spent too many years subordinating herself to the needs of others, putting her children's lives before her own. Now, for the first time in her life, she would put herself first. Not out of selfishness, but out of necessity. If she didn't stand firm now, everything she had built, everything Robert had worked for, would be lost. The day of the court hearing arrived with a chill in the air. Martha knew that the time had come to face Jacob, and she steeled herself for the battle that lay ahead. She would not back down. The weight of her children's futures, of Robert's legacy, of her own sense of self-respect, everything was on the line. Nathan was by her side, as always, his calm presence steadying her nerves. She knew this wouldn't just be a legal battle. This was a test of her will, her identity, and her family's future. The courtroom was filled with tension, every word of the proceedings thick with the possibility of betrayal. Jacob, sitting across from her with his attorneys, wore a look of determination, though his usual arrogance had faded, replaced by something more dangerous: desperation. When it was Martha's turn to speak, she stood before the judge with a quiet confidence that had grown over the past few weeks. She didn't need to prove her worth. She had done that every day of her life. She simply had to show that she was still the woman who had raised 8 children, managed a successful household, and built a family legacy. With Patricia's help, Martha laid out her case methodically. She provided the neurologist's reports, documents from her attorney, and her own testimony, explaining her clear mental faculties and the unfair treatment she had received from Jacob. "I've spent my entire life managing responsibilities," Martha said calmly, her voice steady but resolute. "I raised my children, built a home, supported a business, and managed family finances. The suggestion that I am incapable of making decisions for myself is not only insulting, it's an attempt to strip me of my autonomy. This trust was meant to provide for my children and preserve the legacy of my husband, Robert. It was never meant to be a tool for manipulation." The courtroom was silent as her words sank in. Jacob, though still trying to maintain composure, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Rebecca sat beside him, her expression unreadable. Martha's words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about preserving her dignity, her independence, and her right to make her own decisions. When the judge returned with his ruling, the tension was unbearable. The decision was a victory for Martha. The court ruled in her favor, dismissing Jacob's petition to declare her incompetent. However, the case was far from over. Jacob was still determined to challenge the trust modifications, and the battle for the family's assets was far from finished. In the weeks that followed, Jacob's campaign against Martha continued, but the tide was beginning to turn. The legal battle was expensive and exhausting, but Martha found strength in the support of her children, particularly Nathan, Emma, and Sophia. Even Daniel, who had been conflicted, had come around, offering his financial expertise to help secure the family's future. Jacob's financial mismanagement at Sullivan Construction became a focal point of the ongoing proceedings. Investigations into the company's finances revealed that he had been diverting funds into personal accounts, using the business's money for his own lavish lifestyle, including renovations on his vacation home in Aspen. The audit results, along with the legal documents Martha had gathered, exposed Jacob's actions for what they were: fraudulent, deceitful, and self-serving. At the same time, Jacob's personal life began to unravel. His relationship with Rebecca, already strained by his actions, finally reached a breaking point. She filed for separation, unable to reconcile the man she had married with the person he had become. She was still committed to raising their children, but the trust, once the foundation of their marriage, had been shattered. Martha watched from the sidelines as her children tried to piece together the remnants of their family. It was painful to see Jacob's fall from grace, but she couldn't deny the relief she felt knowing that he could no longer manipulate her or the family's wealth. The months that followed were filled with healing and rebuilding. Jacob, now out of the CEO position at Sullivan Construction, began his own journey of recovery. He checked himself into rehab and, for the first time, sought therapy for his deep-seated issues. Martha didn't know what the future held for him or their relationship, but she knew that, for the first time in years, he was taking responsibility for his actions. As Martha sat on the porch swing, looking out at the cherry blossoms Robert had planted so many years ago, she realized that her fight was not just for her independence, it was for her family's future. She had weathered the storm, and though it had left scars, it had also given her something precious: the freedom to live her life on her terms, to make her own choices, and to trust in herself again. Howard Thompson, who had been a steadfast friend and ally throughout this ordeal, was now someone Martha allowed into her life in a deeper, more personal way. Their connection had grown, not just as allies in the legal battle, but as friends, and possibly something more. "Are you ready for this next chapter?" he asked one afternoon, joining her on the porch. Martha smiled, a soft, genuine smile that spoke of quiet strength. "Yes," she replied, "I think I am." The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Martha felt at peace. She had reclaimed her voice, her independence, and her place in the world. And she was ready for whatever came next.